Yeah, so we're going to talk about getting your GIS house in order today. Again, we're going to kind of focus on two workflows here, what we call a gaps analysis, and then we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit and look at some content auditing for ArcGIS Enterprise, and more specifically as that pertains to preparing for an ArcGIS Enterprise upgrade. So again, just a little bit more of an introduction. Um, we're going to approach this from two different levels. So when you think of a gaps analysis, you're looking more at the organizational level view. And I'll go into more detail on this, but basically what the gaps analysis is it's an overall assessment of your GIS program. So one of the things you'll get out of that is sort of a baseline score, and then that allows you to kind of set some priorities and figure out, what we need to do to kind of provide a roadmap to improve your GIS program. So that's a little bit more of a high level assessment, and then again, we're going to look at ArcGIS Enterprise, a little bit more specific use case. Again, that's planning for an ArcGIS Enterprise upgrade. And as we do a lot of these enterprise upgrades, we realize that sometimes people don't realize that there is a lot of work that needs to be done first. So that's kind of the process I'm going to walk you through today. So we'll start off with the gaps analysis or gaps assessment. And so what is it? You can see at the top there, GAP stands for Geospatial Assessment and Progress Score. So essentially, like I said, it's kind of an organizational assessment, right? So it's a way for your organization to begin benchmarking its geospatial capabilities and creates a means to monitor and revisit the progress along the way. So as we start to see these results, this isn't just a one-time assessment. It's something that we want to provide you these results. You can see we're going to give you a score from 0 to 100. And then it's really based on 8 key areas, and I'll go into those, but you'll see that you get a score for each one of those areas and then kind of an overall aggregate score. The gaps analysis is based on what SWOT analysis, if you're familiar with that. So what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Can we identify opportunities for you to expand your geospatial program within your organization? And are there threats to that process? And then finally, that last point there, we can call gaps analysis or gaps assessment kind of a lightweight geospatial strategy. It's not going to be a full-blown geospatial strategy, but if you think of it more in terms of kind of a stepping stone in that overall process, it'll help you kind of define that baseline again, set some goals and set some priorities on things, again, to help you kind of move your program forward. So who is GAPS intended for? Really anyone looking to benchmark the current status of their GIS program. So, the examples I give here, maybe your GIS is growing. You're not having any problems with that, but at the same time, maybe you need an assessment to make sure you have all of your SOPs in place and things like that, your data governance, just kind of make sure you have those foundational pieces in place as your program is growing. Maybe you're going through a program realignment. So, over the last several years, as GIS has become more reliant on the IT infrastructure and IT staff, we've seen where maybe organizations are realigning their GIS program from, say, public works department or your planning department or something to a more centralized department in IT. So you kind of start that assessment piece as you work through that realignment. Maybe you're new to your organization, or maybe you've had some turnover. So, we've seen cases where somebody will leave an organization and the program just kind of falls in your lap. So, what do you do at that point? So we can assess kind of where you're starting from that point. And then the final point there, we kind of look at some of the data issues. So are there data trust issues? Are there other things that are just kind of hindering you and you're failing to just gain traction with the progress in your geospatial program? So again, I mentioned the gaps analysis focuses on 8 key areas. I'll just kind of go through these and then I'll show you kind of what the results of this looks like. So the first one here, strategic and operational planning. We'll talk about things like, is there a GIS champion in the upper levels of your organization? So do you have department heads, or maybe it's the city manager or somebody like that that you can rely on to kind of spread and help you kind of plan for the expansion of GIS in your organization? Do you have processes where you evaluate the use of GIS in your organization? And do you use that for future planning? The next one is staffing and resources. So, do you have proper staffing levels to achieve the goals of your program? Do you have enough staffing to just kind of keep everything afloat? So you can kind of prioritize and plan for staffing. And then in terms of other resources, you can think of things like training. If you have the appropriate staffing levels, are they being trained? Are they staying up to date on the technology? Do you have the proper licensing resources? So, one of the things we see, especially in local government or municipal GIS, is the procurement process can really drag out, and sometimes you're butting up against that, and it's going to slow down the progress of your geospatial program. User engagement and mobility. So how well are your users engaged with GIS? Is there a potential for expansion into other departments? Are there staff members in other departments that maybe they don't know the capabilities of GIS? So maybe we can reach out to them, engage them and do lunch and learns or something like that. So we can assess kind of what the status of that is. Are you using mobile solutions for daily tasks? So mobility is becoming a huge piece of GIS. We see where you go into an organization and maybe you have field workers that are still doing their daily inspection and maintenance in the field, but they're using a pen and paper still. So can we find instances where we can kind of supplement those workflows with a mobile GIS solution? Interoperability and automation. So do you have automations built into your geospatial program? You can automate things like daily tasks, or are you connected to other systems where we're transferring data, the kind of ETL processes and things like that? Are you tied in with your work order systems? Are you bringing in live feeds from ABL or any other kind of live data feeds? And then, any other third-party applications. Collaboration and sharing. So, what is the level of sharing and distribution of GIS, within your organization, with the public, with other agencies, maybe in your area, or if you have contractors that do your work for you, do you have a process in place where they can request that data? Is there a process in place for sharing that data? Kind of some of that data governance type stuff. Is your data, do you have it classified on, yes, this can be shared with the public, and no, these data sets cannot. And then that kind of ties into standards and processes as well. Do you have standards in place to maintain the integrity of your data and processes? So here, we're kind of talking about, do you have documented SOPs? Do you define what your local coordinate system and all of your data is in that coordinate system? Do you have defined schemas for your data? Just kind of some of those standards that once you start to follow those things, you're building up that nice foundation, data-wise and procedure-wise. And then the last one there, we're kind of seeing this more and more common, your organization branding. So let's say we're going to create a new web application, and when we turn this out to the public, are we using the correct colors and fonts and logos for, the standards that our organization has established? And then the last two here, very similar: data quality and integrity, and then data coverage. So to what extent is your GIS data accurate, complete, and does your staff trust the data that they use? Is it protected? So again, kind of the data governance piece here. Do you classify your data so we know like what can be shared and what can't? Are we using, if we're collecting data in the field, are we required to use those GPS metadata fields and things like that? And then data coverage. So we say, considering all potential GIS data your organization could have, what is the level of coverage for each one of those layers or data sets? So, this, you kind of think of this in terms of kind of your data foundation. So, do we have a complete street centerline layer? Do we have address points? Is all the attribute information we need on those layers present and filled out? Just kind of that foundational data type stuff. So those are the 8 key areas that we focus on. And then as we go through that series of questions, as we start to do this assessment, we'll put all of that information together. And then this is sort of the first piece of the results. So in the graphic on the left there, you can see that we will give you a score for each one of those 8 areas that I just mentioned. And we specifically call out like, hey, you're average in this category, you're below average, you're well above average. And then at the bottom, we kind of give you that aggregate score. And there's some weighting of things that we build into that, but gives you a very clear kind of view of where you're at in some of these categories. And one thing I like to mention here, just because we score well in some of these categories versus others, as we move to the next piece of this, you'll see that doesn't necessarily mean that shouldn't be a priority, right? So as we move into the next piece and we start to set those priorities, like here you can see that we scored very well in our data categories, right? And maybe that's what we want to maintain. So here you can see the next piece. After we get those scores, the next step to this is we group all of those answers into low, medium, and high scores. So then you can see we'll start to work through and add some comments. We'll start to assign priorities. And then this eventually is going to be kind of that driver that's going to move, your geospatial program forward. So as I mentioned, let's say our data categories, we scored very high. That doesn't necessarily mean we don't need to keep addressing that issue, right? So maybe we still want to assign that as a high priority level 1, because we know that's a foundation of how we want to proceed with our geospatial program. So there's a little bit of art to this. Every organization is different, but it just kind of gives you that good baseline and foundation to kind of realize, where you might have some weaknesses. Again, kind of that SWOT analysis type thing. What's our strengths, weaknesses? Are there opportunities here that, are very easily visible? And then maybe this is where you can identify some of those threats as well. So in summary, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, can I interrupt you for a question? What does
Sure.
AVL stand for?
That's automatic vehicle location. So do you track your fleet vehicles or, like maybe your garbage trucks or something like that? So it'd be like a live data feed of where your vehicle locations are at.
Thanks.
Yeah, good question. Yeah. So just in summary here, the gaps analysis, again, think about this as you're assessing your entire geospatial program, right? So thinking back to the title of this, keeping your GIS house in order. So this is kind of we're going to create that baseline. We're going to identify our strengths and weaknesses. And then we're going to start to kind of define our priorities. What can we begin addressing as soon as possible? Some of those lower scored things that we've identified, just a little bit of change can make a huge difference, right? So maybe we can address those over the next quarter. We can identify some priorities that we want to accomplish over the next year. And then again, just other things we can address as needed. And then that last point there, I think is very important. We want you to revisit and update your progress, right? This should be a living document. As you start to check some of these things off, go in there and adjust your priorities and update your progress. Maybe you can change some of those scores. And then as you get a year or two into this, maybe you go back and do a whole brand new assessment and then just kind of see if anything else kind of falls out. But yeah, again, so organizational level a little bit higher, but gives you kind of that good baseline and understanding of what your geospatial program looks like. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and kind of move into the ArcGIS Enterprise side of things. Again, planning for an ArcGIS Enterprise upgrade. And you'll see the little note there at the top, a little housekeeping first, right? Planning an upgrade for ArcGIS Enterprise is not as simple as just saying, hey, I want to upgrade to version 11.5. Let me get my software, my license codes, all that, and let's do it. There's a lot of work sometimes that can lead up to that process. So first, we'll just start like, why do we need to upgrade, right? Obviously, we want the latest and greatest. So, access to new features and enhancements. When we talk in terms of ArcGIS Enterprise, as opposed to ArcGIS Online, when Esri updates these products, when you get an update in ArcGIS Online, they're just built in, right? So in terms of ArcGIS Enterprise, we have to manually install those, right? So when we go to that next version that includes those features, it's an actual install. We want to maintain our performance and reliability. Obviously, we want the greatest security enhancements and patches and things like that. And then you always want to stay on a supported version, right? If something were to go wrong, we want to have that ability to reach out to support, right? So thinking about that, so now what do we need to know before we upgrade? So the first thing I like to call out is the product lifecycle. And as we're planning our upgrade, two things we need to know: what version are we starting at? And then kind of what version do we want to land at? And there's a few things that can kind of determine that. Different versions offer different support terms, right? So you have long-term, short-term support. The odd number versions are long-term. The even number versions are short-term. So maybe your organization has the resources and ability to stay on those short-term supports. So you're just going to go through this process, much more frequent than if you decide to go to a long-term support. So we need to know that product life cycle, right? And then we also need to know what changes happen in between our starting point and our ending point. And something that really kind of helps us figure this out. So this is the ArcGIS Enterprise Lifecycle document from technical support. So if you just start in the top left, you'll see current version is 11.5. It was released in May of 2025. And then you see kind of the four phases of the software lifecycle support. So the one I like to call it here is mature support, the third one. You'll see that once Enterprise enters mature support, you're not going to get any more software updates or patches. So we need to plan ahead because, again, we want to stay on a fully supported version, right? So we can kind of look at some of these dates. And if you look towards the bottom, you'll see that I've highlighted version 10.9.1. If you look in the mature support column, December 1st, a month and a half from now, 10.9.1 will enter mature support. That's important to know just because of the mature support issue, but also the reason I call that out, if you look at the top right, version 10.9.1 is the end of the ArcMap runtimes. So if we're starting at a version prior to version 10.9.1, and let's say we want to go to 11.5, we know we have that obstacle of ArcMap runtimes being retired in the middle. So if we're going to make that jump, we have to make sure that all of our ArcMap workflows, any map services, feature services, anything like that we have published, that all needs to be converted to ArcGIS Pro. So again, that could be a huge housekeeping thing that we need to kind of figure out how much work that's going to be before we can make that jump. Kind of in the middle of that right column over there, you'll see 11.5. we like to call it just kind of a nice landing spot for your preparation. Obviously, if you're coming from an earlier version, there's some work to get there. It's a long-term support being, the odd number version. Um, but then you can see right below that, version 12.0 is expected this quarter. And there are some major retirements. Number one being Web App Builder. You can see highlighted there at the top. So if you have any Web App Builder applications, you could have, let's say you have 50 of these in your organization. Those are all going to need to be updated before we can go to version 12.0 or 12.1, whatever that might be. So 11.5 is a really nice place. It doesn't enter mature support until June of 2029. So that kind of gives us that runway to kind of get all of our housekeeping in order and get those things updated before we need to make that jump. And one last thing I'll mention about 12.0 while I'm here. At the bottom of that, you see there's an updated life cycle. So the dates, kind of this timeline you see here, and let's say the version 11s, that's going to get condensed when we go to 12. So short-term support is going to be 1 year, and long-term support is going to be 4 years. So the things I'm mentioning now, as we move into the 12s, those are going to speed up even more. So just something to keep in mind, as we're kind of updating this stuff. So that kind of helps us understand the timing. I mentioned like there's those roadblocks in the way depending on what version we're starting at and what we're going to. So what you see on the right here is a deprecation notice from the Esri technical support site. So this one is going from 11.5 to 12.0. You can see they specifically list out everything that you need to be aware of, right? So again, Web App Builder, if you have any configurable apps, Map Viewer Classic, and then kind of some more technical stuff in there. So this is where we kind of try to figure out how much housekeeping we have, right? And how do we do that? Like, how do we know how much of this content we have in our portal? So here's some tools, some better than others. You can see the image at the top there. So this is a picture of our gallery, and I use the filtering method on the left-hand side there. You can kind of see, you click on apps, and then I've highlighted Web App Builder. So if we had any Web App Builder applications that we need to update before we proceed with an enterprise update, they would show up here, right? So kind of a manual process, takes a little bit more effort. The next one I'll call out there is reports. So if you go to your organization tab and then under status, I believe there's a couple options for reports. And that item report is what you're going to see the image of in the bottom right-hand corner there. Again, it's going to tell you everything you have in there in your portal. You can filter that down by item type, like you see highlighted there. The problem is it only tells you web mapping application. So it doesn't give you those specifics. And what you have to do, the column to the left there, the item URL, built into those URLs, it actually will tell you what kind of application that is. So you can do some searching and reporting on that column, and it'll kind of tell you what you have that needs to be updated. The best option at the bottom there, the custom option, there's a deprecated app script. And basically what that does, we run that against your portal, and it's going to give us a list of everything that's built on a product that is deprecated or being retired. So we run that, we get that report, and it shows us exactly what we need to update before we start to move, to our next version of ArcGIS Enterprise. So again, could be a lot of work depending on how much you've stayed on top of these things, but just something that we want you to be aware of if you're planning an enterprise upgrade. So just to wrap up here, we covered a lot of ground, but if you are planning for an ArcGIS Enterprise upgrade, know your timeline, know what version you're starting at, know what version you want to end up at, again, based on maybe the support life cycle or whatever, other constraints your organization might have. Audit and inventory your content. Again, this is that housekeeping piece. you could have a lot of work before you get to that actual upgrade piece. And then, take those kind of two pieces together and develop a plan. And, this is something where we see this a lot. CloudPoint can help you with that. If you've got, 50 applications that need to be migrated from Web App Builder to Experience Builder, that's something we have a lot of experience with. And then again, gaps analysis, that's going to give you that very high level organizational assessment of where your GIS program is at, kind of give you that roadmap ahead of things you need to keep on your radar and assign priority to and things like that.